cavalry positioned on flanks. Psamtik, wearing the blue war crown of Pharaoh, surveyed his forces with nervous pride. His first battle would be his kingdom's greatest victory, or so he believed. The Persian army appeared from the desert heat like a mirage, becoming terrifyingly real. Their approach was oddly slow, methodical. Egyptian lookouts strained to make sense of what they saw. The enemy's formation seemed wrong somehow, their front lines strangely bulky. Then came the sounds that made Egyptian soldiers glance at each other in confused horror. Not just the expected thunder of marching feet and war drums, but something else, meowing. Thousands of cats crying out in the morning air. As the Persian front line came into arrow range, that crucial 300 yards where Egyptian archers expected to begin their deadly work, the impossible became visible. Persian soldiers had living cats tied to their shields. Living, crying, sacred cats strapped to their defensive equipment. Behind them, more soldiers carried poles with cages containing ibises, the sacred birds of Thoth. Dogs sacred to Anubis were leashed to warriors' belts. The Egyptian archers froze like statues. Their trained instinct screamed to loose arrows, to darken the sky with bronze-tipped death. But their souls recoiled in absolute horror. To shoot meant risking the life of a sacred animal. Not just risking, guaranteeing. Even if they aimed for exposed flesh, some arrows would hit the creatures. It would be sacrilege. It would be damnation. But Cambyses' weapon extended beyond the physical animals. He'd ordered his men to paint images of Bastet on their shields, to wear amulets of Egyptian gods. The psychological assault was total. Every Persian soldier had transformed himself into a walking blasphemy that Egyptians couldn't attack without damning their own souls for eternity. "Draw your bows!" Psamtik's command rang out from the walls. The archers obeyed with trembling hands. Thousands of arrows knocked in perfect synchronization. "Take aim!" Arms drew back. Bowstrings creaked with tension that was physical and spiritual. The Persians continued advancing steadily. 200 yards, 150. The cats' cries grew louder, more distressed. Loose. Nothing happened. Here and there, an archer released, aiming high, deliberately missing. Most simply, stood frozen, arrows knocked, arms trembling with the strain of held draw, tears streaming down their faces. One archer, named Kenty of Memphis, would later describe the moment. "I saw a Persian soldier with a dog tied to his shield, and behind it, the face of a young man, perhaps my own age. I knew I could put an arrow through his eye. I knew my duty to Pharaoh. But I also knew that to harm the sacred animal was to invite the wrath of Anubis for all eternity. My hand would not release. My soul overruled my training." Cambyses, watching from his chariot, raised his sword. The Persian army stopped just outside accurate arrow range, about 100 yards. Then, in an act of calculated cruelty, they began their demonstration. Persian soldiers held up cats one by one, as if presenting them to the Egyptian army. The message was crystal clear: shoot us and these die. The Egyptian lines began to waver visibly. Soldiers looked to their officers, officers to their generals, generals to Psamtik. The young pharaoh faced an impossible choice: order his men to commit mass sacrilege or watch his kingdom fall. He chose a third option: negotiation. "Hold," Psamtik commanded. He would send an embassy, demand the Persians fight with honor. But Cambyses had anticipated this. When the Egyptian herald approached under a flag of truce, the Persian response was simple and devastating. "We fight with the gods of Egypt as our shields. If your gods abandon you, perhaps they were never yours to begin with." Then Cambyses gave the order that would echo through eternity: advance. The Persian army resumed its march. Slowly, inexorably, they walked toward Egyptian lines. No charge, no battle cries, just the steady approach of men who knew their enemies were already defeated. As the armies closed, Persian soldiers began calling out in broken Egyptian, "Bastet protects us. Your gods march with Persia. Strike us down and damn yourselves." The religious taunting shattered Egyptian morale like hammer blows on glass. Some Egyptian units tried to fight. A group of Nubian auxiliaries, less bound by Egyptian religious law, launched arrows at exposed Persian flanks, but they were too few. The main Egyptian force stood paralyzed, watching their doom approach one step at a time. At 50 yards, close enough to see the tears in Egyptian eyes, the Persians stopped again. This was the moment of final psychological breaking. They didn't need to attack. They simply waited, letting Egyptian soldiers fully comprehend their impossible situation. The sacred animals continued their cries. The sun climbed higher. Egyptian will crumbled like sandcastles before the tide. Then came the moment that shattered Egypt's soul. A single Egyptian archer, his name lost to history, loosed an arrow in frustration or despair. It struck a cat tied to a Persian shield. The animal's death cry pierced the morning air. The Egyptian army collectively gasped. Men fell to their knees. Some began praying for forgiveness. Others simply dropped their weapons and fled. That single arrow had broken more than a battle line. It had broken a civilization's spirit. Cambyses gave the order. Advance. The Persian war machine surged forward, sacred animals and all. What followed was not a battle, but a one-sided slaughter. The Egyptian line didn't break, it simply dissolved like salt statues in rain. The animal shield advanced relentlessly. Cats tied to shields yowled in fear. Ibises beat their wings against cage bars. Dogs snarled and barked. Persian soldiers moved in perfect discipline behind their living barriers with spears leveled, confidence absolute. Individual Egyptian soldiers faced personal hells. Amenhotep, captain of archers, stood on Pelusium's walls with drawn bow. Below him, a Persian climbed a siege ladder with a white cat strapped across his chest. Amenhotep had killed dozens in border skirmishes. His arrow could punch through bronze armor, but his hands shook. The cat's green eyes seemed to stare directly at him. In that moment, Amenhotep saw not an enemy soldier, but a test from Bastet herself. He lowered his bow. The Persian crested the wall. Amenhotep died on a Persian blade, whispering prayers for forgiveness. The Persian advance under sacred protection was methodical genius. First came the front line with cats on shields. Behind them, a second line carried poles with bird cages, creating a visual barrier of sacred creatures. The third line was conventional heavy infantry, ready to exploit any gap. Cambyses had created the world's first combined arms formation using theological warfare. Step by step, the Persians closed on Egyptian positions. At the fortress gates, Egyptian officers held frantic debates. "We must fight," General Khanib shouted. "The kingdom depends on us." But High Priest Amenhotep countered, "Better the kingdom fall than the gods abandon Egypt forever." As they argued, Persian battering rams decorated with images of Egyptian gods approached the gates. What happened next defied military logic. Some Egyptian units actually helped the Persians. Seeing sacred animals in distress, Egyptian soldiers broke ranks to ensure the creatures weren't harmed in the fighting. One papyrus fragment records an Egyptian sergeant carefully guiding a Persian soldier with a cat shield through his own lines, unable to reconcile duty to Pharaoh with duty to the gods. Within the first hour, over 1,000 Egyptians had fallen without inflicting significant Persian casualties. The killing was one-sided, mechanical, horrifying. Persians simply walked up to paralyzed Egyptians and struck them down. Some Egyptians didn't even raise their shields, accepting death rather than risk accidentally harming a sacred animal in self-defense. The line breaks began at Pelusium's main gate. Egyptian infantry pressed back against the fortress walls, faced a choice: stand and die, or flee and live. They chose life. First in trickles, then in floods, Egyptian soldiers abandoned their positions. They threw down weapons, stripped off armor, and ran. Then came the only moment of Egyptian glory in that dark day. The Nubian Guard, Psamtik's elite personal troops of 300 men, made their stand. These warriors from beyond the cataracts followed Egyptian gods, but weren't as paralyzed by Egyptian religious law. Their captain, a giant named Kashta, bellowed to his men, "The gods understand warrior honor. Better to die fighting than live as Persian slaves." The Nubians formed a square, spears out, and actually pushed back the first Persian assault. For 30 minutes, they held a small hill, their disciplined resistance a lone island in an ocean of Egyptian collapse. Cambyses himself took notice, directing reinforcements to surround them. But the Nubians wouldn't break. They sang war songs from their homeland, their deep voices carrying over the screams and clash of bronze. Cambyses ordered his men to offer the Nubians terms surrender and serve Persia with honor. Kashta's response was a thrown spear that nearly took a Persian officer's head. The end came when Persian engineers brought forward mobile cages filled with the most sacred cats from Bubastis, Bastet's holy city. These weren't just any cats. They wore golden collars, marking them as temple animals. To harm them wasn't just sacrilege, it was cosmic blasphemy. The Persians pushed these cages toward the Nubian square. Even Kashta's iron will cracked. He couldn't order his men to fight through living avatars of the goddess herself. The Nubian square wavered, loosened, and finally broke. Kashta died as he lived, standing defiant, his spear red with Persian blood. Of his 300 men, none survived. They'd chosen death over both sacrilege and surrender. The final collapse came with horrifying swiftness. Pelusium's gates, abandoned by their defenders, stood open. Persian troops poured into the fortress city. Egyptian soldiers crowded the docks, desperately seeking boats to escape. Others fled south toward Memphis, discarding weapons to run faster. The famous Egyptian military discipline built over millennia evaporated in hours. Psamtik's escape attempt became the day's final humiliation. Surrounded by a small guard, the young pharaoh tried to flee through Pelusium's southern gate, but Phanes had anticipated this. Greek mercenaries in Persian service blocked the escape route. The traitor himself appeared, still wearing his Egyptian armor but with a Persian cloak over it. "Your Majesty," he mocked in perfect Egyptian, "the gods have spoken. They march with Persia now." The young pharaoh, barely into his 20s, faced his kingdom's destroyer. For a moment, witnesses say Psamtik seemed ready to charge Phanes personally. Then his shoulders slumped. The weight of disaster, the impossibility of fighting gods themselves, crushed his spirit. He surrendered his sword, the ceremonial blade of pharaohs, to a Greek traitor in Persian service. Egypt's independence died in that gesture. As the sun reached its zenith, so did the slaughter. 50,000 Egyptian casualties littered the battlefield. Persian losses, perhaps 7,000, mostly from the Nubian last stand. But numbers don't capture the true horror. The battlefield reeked not of death alone, but of incense and cat fur mixed with blood and sand. Sacred animals, their purpose served, were carefully collected by Persian soldiers. Most survived. Cambyses had given strict orders that the creatures be unharmed once victory was achieved. They were still sacred, still useful for controlling the Egyptian population. With Egypt's army shattered, the empire's fate was sealed. Pelusium fell within a single day. Defenders simply abandoned their posts. Why defend walls when the gods themselves had switched sides? The race to Memphis began immediately, but Cambyses needn't have worried. The psychological weapons spread faster than his cavalry. City after city opened their gates. Psamtik, racing toward Memphis with remnants of his guard, found no sanctuary. He surrendered after days of futile resistance. Egypt became a Persian province for the next 200 years. The lesson was clear and terrifying. Know your enemy's soul and you own their sword. In war, the strongest fortress is worthless if defenders won't man the walls. The sharpest arrows are useless if archers won't draw their bows. The civilization that built monuments to eternity fell to an army of cats. Subscribe to Great History for more battles, where psychological warfare defeated military might and faith became the ultimate weakness.